Welcome to Open Minds Radio with Alejandro Rojas. Open Minds Radio is your UFO news authority, presenting evidence and the latest news regarding the UFO phenomenon. Here's your host, Alejandro Rojas.
Bing, bong, bong, bong. Hello, it is I, Alejandro, and I am so happy to be back with you all today. And I am also happy to say that Jason has returned, and we have our news correspondent today. And so I'm very happy about that. First, I want to tell you about who we're talking to today, and that is a Mr. Grant Cameron, who is a good buddy, even though he can't say my name. But I think the way he says it is kind of funny. He's Canadian, so it's kind of like French. He says, Alejandro. Thank you, Alejandro. And you'll hear what I'm talking about soon. We're going to talk to Grant about his origin story. That's what I'm going to call it from now on. It's like, you know, the comic books, you have the origin story. How did Wolverine, you know, become the dude with the claws and stuff? How did Grant Cameron get into UFOs? And his origin story is really cool because it started with this UFO flap. A bunch of people seeing UFOs near Winnipeg in Canada for a couple of years. And I mean, you could go out to this area and see these things. And in fact, Grant would take people out to go see these things and chase them, and some harrowing, adventurous stories that he's going to tell us about how he got started in all of this. So really cool stories. I was recently writing about him in Open Minds magazine, and I was writing about this, and I guess I've talked to him so much about it, I was just fascinated. I assumed that we had talked about this on the radio show before, and I went and listened to my interviews with Grant, and we hadn't talked about it. So I definitely had to get this down. I know this is stuff that you all, my listeners, will really like. So I had to make sure that we could talk just about Charlie Redstar. And that is what the UFO was named, Charlie Redstar. So this is going to be a great show. It's very exciting, very crazy, very important flap of UFO sightings in Canada in the mid-'70s. Grant was already in college at this time, whereas I was just being born, and that just shows you how much older Grant is than I. All right, so we'll talk to Grant in just a minute. Of course, I should have mentioned Grant Cameron is the guy who runs presidentialufo.com, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Well, we've recovered from the Congress, but the media hasn't, because stuff that happened at the Congress, such as the general and his UFO videos, hit the news like wildfire. But to talk more about the news, let's bring on our news correspondent, Jason McClellan.
Woohoo!
Da-da-da.
How's it going, Alejandro?
Good. How are you?
Fantastic, sir. Great to be back this week.
Great to have you back.
I missed everyone last week. And, you know, you bring up a good point that I like to mention, and we talk about this sometimes, but with a lot of media still picking up on the Chilean general story, a lot of mainstream media tends to be, and I was talking with our colleague Maureen about this, I think last week, mainstream media seems to be 1 to 2 weeks behind in a lot of stories.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed that. You know, they'll pick up on a story that happened a week or two ago,
Right.
and one of them will take it, and then that'll fuel this whole, you know, second wave of news stories coming out about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that a lot with the general story now, too.
Yeah, which is good. At least it comes out. A good example of that. Well, you'll probably talk about a Nick Pope story that came out like a week ago.
I won't talk about that,
Well,
so
I'll
go
talk
ahead.
about it, yeah. And then, well, I think I already talked about it last week.
I think you did.
Actually. And then Lee Spiegel is writing about it on the Huffington Post today.
Right.
And so that gives it more life.
Yep, that's right. And more people read about it. It gets picked up by additional sources. It's a good thing, but it's not exactly breaking news, which is
Right.
unfortunate, but that's
We
where we
break
come
the
in.
news.
That's right. Well, let's get into it, Alejandro. Greetings, everyone. This is your Open Minds News Brief for Monday, March 19th, 2012. Well, talking about a different Cameron from our guest today, David Cameron. You and I were just
Right.
talking about this. British Prime Minister David Cameron paid a visit to the United States last week. Cameron was given the red carpet treatment on Tuesday when he arrived in the U.S. His three-day visit included a ride on Air Force One, taking in a March Madness basketball game and a hot dog with President Obama, and a swanky star-studded dinner at the White House. But where business was concerned, Cameron discussed the extradition treaty between his country and the U.S. that has caused more than a decade of grief for UK UFO hacker Gary McKinnon. The Scottish computer hacker was charged by the U.S. with the, quote, biggest military computer hack of all time in 2001 and 2002 after looking for information about UFOs and extraterrestrials in NASA's computers, and he's been fighting extradition ever since. His mother, Janice Sharp, has been fighting nonstop on his behalf. She met with David Cameron multiple times and even wrote an open letter to President Obama, quote, pleading with him to end 10 years of torment, end quote, according to the Daily Mail. This recent meeting between Obama and Cameron is not the only instance when McKinnon and the extradition treaty have been discussed. Sharp told the Wellwyn-Hatfield Times, quote, David Cameron has gone to Obama 3 times now, and I hope it's third time lucky. The Wellwyn-Hatfield Times reports that following the recent meeting, Cameron stated, quote, I raised this issue with President Obama today, and we had a good discussion. We will be following this up with further talks between our teams. The McKinnon case has fueled criticism of the UK's extradition agreement with the US. Many in the UK feel that the treaty is unfairly weighted against UK citizens. Sharp hopes the latest meeting between Obama and Cameron will lead to McKinnon being tried in the UK. We haven't talked about Gary McKinnon for a while, but still ongoing. More than 10 years now.
Yeah, and this is something the Prime Minister, I guess, doesn't have much control over, but at the same time, the issue is in one of their houses of legislation. They have a bunch of them, and the Home Secretary, I think, is the one who it sits with on the British side. That person can come make a ruling at any moment and say we're sending him or not, but it seems like they're kind of stalling to hopefully work it out where they don't have to. But I think you got to really give credit to David Cameron, because he said pre-election you kind of use this for political energy, saying, you know, I'm going to make sure we figure this out. And he's been true to his word, you know, even on such a controversial subject. He has brought this up several times in his career with Obama and his administration.
And on a similar subject, it was just either last week or the week before, there was an article about just how vulnerable NASA still is and how it was recently hacked again. And, you know, a lot of the government computers, and, you know, they were supposedly learning their lesson from the McKinnon hack and upping their security and everything, but their computers are still wide open.
Yeah. If there are any NASA scientists listening, don't make your login just login and your password simply password, because you may figure that you're being really smart, but that's actually easy to hack into a computer that way.
But those are easy to remember. Those are my passwords.
Uh-oh. Now your computer's getting hacked.
I'm just kidding. Well, in other news, Hollywood loves the UFO extraterrestrial theme. We talk about this a lot. We actually devoted an entire magazine to Hollywood and UFOs.
Right.
But movie plots frequently include ET characters, and more times than not, these extraterrestrials are depicted as hostile towards humans. And that's a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah.
But 2 recent examples of this are the greatly hyped upcoming movies Prometheus and Battleship. These 2 examples typify Hollywood's favorite presentation of extraterrestrials. Although this cynical view of intelligent extraterrestrial life is likely flawed for a variety of reasons, Nick Sagan, son of famed astronomer Carl Sagan, explains the one issue he has with Hollywood's alien invasion flicks. The humans always win. According to Blaster.com, Nick Sagan thinks victory for humans against hostile extraterrestrials is unlikely. Sagan believes, quote, if they're advanced enough to cross the enormous distances of interstellar space, they're advanced enough to wipe us out without breaking whatever in their physiology passes for a sweat. Nick Sagan is one of many experts interviewed in a new 2-part series on the Science Channel called Alien Encounters. Part 1 of the series premiered on March 13th, and Part 2 airs tomorrow on Tuesday, March 20th. On the Science Channel, and it's part of their month-long series titled Are We Alone? And they've been doing this for the month of March, and it includes
Pretty cool.
a couple different series that are all part of this big series as a whole. But while I do kind of poke fun at Nick Sagan here for, the overgeneralization, like most people do, that making assumptions. I mean, assumptions is really all we can do. But he's a really sharp guy, and he's really being more vocal about this subject. He is excited about, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And he's been a sci-fi author, and he actually, I didn't know this, but he actually wrote a couple episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could be hurting their feelings. There could have been a big craft of nice guys who came, and then, they got close enough to watch our movies and saw us, fighting with them and stuff, and they're like, man, they think we're a bunch of jerk-offs. Let's get out of here, They're like, ugh. Could have hurt their feelings, and they took off, and they're like, we were going to help you, but...
I know, our TV probably upsets them, and, well, if they watch shows, with extraterrestrial characters like Alf and some of the, the 80s shows, that could be offensive as well, but...
right.
I know a lot of people, like to make this jump and say that, if extraterrestrials come here, that means they have technology to carry them through great distances of space, and that's assuming they're coming from far away. I still, there's still a possibility that there's intelligent life on the moon. I mean, right here, right next to us.
Yeah.
We don't know that. So assuming that, they're coming from far away, that's assumption number one. There's a lot of assumptions to be made, but
Carl Sagan, his father, believed that, if they could create the technology to come over here, they must have resolved some of their social issues, and they would be more advanced socially as well, and so that they probably would be good guys. So,
well, and I like to turn the table and say, well,
Michio Kaku says the same thing.
What if we go to the moon and find intelligent life there? That doesn't mean that our technology is so superior, and that doesn't mean we've resolved all of our issues, because we certainly haven't.
But we're talking vast distances.
We are, but we don't have to.
The moon, that's not too far.
No, it's not.
I could go there tomorrow. I could go there right now, Mikey. Yeah.
I would like to join you. Let's go.
I
am ready to go to the moon.
There was a movie, though, where we didn't win recently. That kind of homemade movie, or it wasn't homemade. It was still...
Apollo 18?
No, the one that was kind of made, it was an alien invasion one, and where they made it in their apartment complex, and it was all shot
Skyline?
Yeah, that one. Hopefully that's not a spoiler for anybody.
I haven't seen it yet. I am so pissed
now
off.
You know.
Yeah. Well, in other news, and Alejandro, you mentioned this story last week in my absence, but a couple weeks ago we reported on a mysterious bright flash of light that occurred during a live television broadcast on Fox 10 in Phoenix, Arizona, right here in our home. On the morning of Thursday, March 8th, new information obtained last week provides a possible explanation for the strange flash of light. Following the incident, Fox 10 contacted local utility providers to see if they could provide an explanation for the light flash, but none of those companies could. But days later, a different story emerged. Local utility company Arizona Public Service, APS, confirmed on Monday, March 12th that an electrical line breaker opened, causing the flash of light, and resulted in a temporary power outage in the area. Although Fox 10 contacted APS and specifically asked them about the incident the previous week, the station reports that APS simply did not realize there had been a breaker issue in the area until an employee of theirs came forward a couple weekends ago to report that he had been called out to the area to address an open breaker. According to Fox 10, quote, the lights were out for a few seconds, then they came back on. There was no damage to equipment, and no power lines had to be replaced. What do you think about that, Alejandro?
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's, you've got some guy in a truck. He's working his shift. Somebody calls, he goes out there, he fills out a paper work order and turns it in. I mean, whoever they talk to isn't going to know about this work order that was filled out, especially if it's something mundane immediately. So I sounds totally logical.
It is certainly likely. And you're right. APS, for those of you who don't know, is it's actually a very large company, and the people the media would talk to are just PR people. They're not necessarily plugged into their call system when people get called out to sites.
Well, and unfortunately, I do that. There's some times where it's like my boss goes to a meeting and someone says, hey, what happened with this? And my boss is like, I don't know. It's rare. And then she comes back and says, do you guys know about this? And oh, I forgot to tell you. It's like sometimes there's breakdowns in communications, more than sometimes.
But I found it was kind of interesting that they say there was no damage to any equipment, nothing had to be replaced. I mean, I would think with a bright flash like that, there'd be like a fried breaker or something that would have to be replaced.
Who knows?
Something, that caused power to go out. I would think something got fried and had to be replaced, but their claim is nothing was damaged, so interesting. But yeah, it's probably the proper identification.
Yeah.
Well, and Alejandro, here's a story for you. More Hollywood stuff, but Michael Bay is a veteran E.T. theme filmmaker, widely known for his Transformers movie franchise. And for those of you who don't know, that's movies about robot extraterrestrials. He also produced the 2011 film I Am Number 4, about a group of teen extraterrestrials who flee to Earth to escape a pursuing predator. But while Bay's depiction of extraterrestrials has generally been better than the Hollywood norm, which I mentioned earlier, which is films involving extraterrestrials as hostile bad guys.
And ugly.
His latest ET-themed project is sure to upset more than a few people, even though it will feature benevolent extraterrestrials. The film to which I am referring is Bay's remake of the popular Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So where do benevolent extraterrestrials fit into the plot of the well-established storyline of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Well, quite confusingly, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles themselves are the extraterrestrials.
Oh.
Bay made the announcement last week at Jazz at Lincoln Center in New York during Nickelodeon's annual Upfront presentation, where he treated audiences to an exclusive look at 3D storyboards for the upcoming live-action movie. And according to Gothamist, Bay provided the following statement about the movie. When you see this movie, kids are going to believe, one day, that these turtles actually do exist when we are done with this movie. These turtles are from an alien race, and they are going to be tough, edgy, funny, and completely lovable. By making the turtles extraterrestrial, Bay is completely rewriting the established origin of these characters.
Their name is mutants. They mutated.
It's right in the name. And as Entertainment Weekly nicely explains, for those of you who don't know, here's the origin of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In the original mythology, 4 baby turtles fall into the sewer and come into contact with glowing radioactive ooze, which mutates them into 4 badass warriors. Bay's wild plot change is sure to upset diehard fans of the original storyline, but it's also another example of Hollywood catering to the public's insatiable interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
In a wild sort of way, completely change this established plot line and make these characters extraterrestrials.
Yeah. Interesting. I wonder if they'll remake you could do that with any movie. You could remake Steel Magnolias and the old lady who is instead an alien.
Then I might actually like that movie.
Yeah, that way it's good for guys and women. It could still be this, heartfelt.
I think you're
thing.
onto something there. We could take a bunch of chick flicks and just change the characters to extraterrestrials.
And boom, crossover.
Yep, crossover. Well, it is interesting, but again, Hollywood loves UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
So, well, Alejandro, that's all the time I have for the news, so I'll cut it there. This has been your Open Minds UFO News Brief. Remember, you can check out all these stories and a lot more at our website, openminds.tv, your source for UFO-related news. I'm Jason McClellan, your Open Minds News correspondent, and you've been briefed. Back to you, Alejandro.
All right. Thank you, Jason. You know what? We'll get into the interview real quick here because we got a lot to talk about with Grant. But I will mention, because I mentioned it before, just for those of you who aren't aware of the Nick Pope story, especially in honor of David Cameron being here. Nick Pope, of course, worked for the Ministry of Defense. We've had him on the show at the UFO desk. And he says he had this extraordinary UFO picture that he even put up on the wall because it was really great. It was this disc. And his boss came by and took it down, put it in a drawer and said, well, I don't know if we should be hanging stuff like that up on the wall. Eventually, it disappeared from this drawer. Nick Pope has since looked for it through the files because it was an extraordinary picture and has not been able to find it. And so he said that recently on a radio interview with the BBC, and that got picked up, and it made the rounds, especially in England, a little bit here. I know I wrote about it on my UFOdailynews.com. I'm sure Jason wrote about it here, too, at openminds.tv. And Lee Spiegel just wrote about it on the Huffington Post. weird news. So check that out. It's a great story. And I haven't read Lee's yet because he just posted it. And I know he did an interview with Nick about this and was going to get some more juicy stuff that nobody else has. So we'll have to check that out. However, I am very excited to have on the show Grant Canyon to talk about Charlie Redstar. So we have a lot to talk about it. Let's go ahead and get into it. I am happy to have back Grant Cameron to the show. And I know we had him recently, but this is really kind of something I've wanted to talk to him about and record on the show. And I know you all on the show are going to love this. And that is the set of sightings, a flap in Canada, that really got you into this subject, right, Grant?
Yeah, exactly, Alejandro. And I appreciate your taking time to review this because it was something that happened now going back 35 years. But just in the last year, I've started to realize that there was some significant aspects to the story that I really didn't realize until just recently. But it is how I started. And as I've told people before, when this thing began, and I live just north of North Dakota. I live in Manitoba, in a major city called Winnipeg, which is about 700,000 people and is sort of notorious as the coldest major city in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this flap of sightings occurred about 35 miles southwest of the city of Winnipeg, just maybe 25 miles north of the U.S.-Canada border. And when this happened, it started in 1975. The actual sighting started in about February of 1975, and they were being picked up by the local media here, the radio stations and the newspaper. And I had clearly sort of remembered that I had no recollection of ever having thought about UFOs or extraterrestrials. Had no interest whatsoever. I was very interested in sort of paranormal phenomena. I was into the Edgar Cayce stuff. When I was at university, I'd done a couple of papers, and one major paper I'd done was I ran around to different hospitals talking to chaplains and asking about near-death stuff.
Oh, cool.
Stuff like, does anybody ever have a vision before they're dying? Does anybody ever predict that they're going to die? Is there any miracles? Does anybody ever get up and walk out of the hospital? And I went from hospital to hospital, and I asked all these different chaplains, and I put this all together in a long paper. And so I was into that kind of stuff, but I don't ever recall being interested in UFOs. The only reason I ever got involved with UFOs was, as I said, like this flap was going on, and this was I can think of all the flaps. It might be the equivalent to sort of the flap that occurred in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Other than that, I can't think of a flap that was as heavy and as long running as this one. It started in February of 1975. It ran very heavy all the way through that year in this town called Carmen. And then the next year, the number of sightings dropped sort of in half, but there's still quite a few. And the sightings were taking place then about 11 miles away from the town in a different town. And so these sightings were going, and basically it was almost every night. And so this was going across the media. And as I guess I was about 22 at the time, somewhere in there. And I was saying to my friends, we used to cruise around the city as young people do, nothing better to do. And we're just driving around in a car. And I said to my friend, who I still have breakfast with every week,
Wow.
I said to him, well, why don't we go out and see what everybody's looking at? Because this was in the news, and this was I think it was March, just about a month after, and this was all over the news. And we said, yeah, okay, but we never did go. And then in early May of 1975, the local TV stations were out there trying to get this thing on camera because it was there all the time. So the big Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was out there, but they weren't very popular because they were basically into the people interviews, and they'd come out there and they'd turn on the lights and they'd want to interview all these people because basically the countryside was just covered with people all out in this small town just trying to see this thing fly by. They'd read about it, they'd heard about it, so they were out there trying to see this thing. And of course, CBC would come and they'd turn the camera lights on and stuff, and people would get furious. Get out of here! What are you trying to do? We can't, because you'd lose your night vision.
Mm-hmm.
But CTV had gone out and had what J. Allen Hynek called the best nocturnal light film that had ever been taken at the time. And J. Allen Hynek had actually come to Winnipeg to lecture, and the one thing that he really wanted when he got here was this film that had been taken by the sort of the opposition to the government. It was the private, it was the CTV network, and they had sent their camera people out to try to photograph this thing. And the tour guide was a guy by the name of Bob Diemert. Now, Bob Diemert ran the airport. It was just a small airport, and he'd fix planes. And he was also notorious for having started the industry of vintage warplanes. He had recovered a Japanese Zero out of a jungle, and he had restored the plane, and he had sold it to the Canadian Air Museum in Ottawa. So he was sort of famous for all these old warplanes that he had, and now it's a big industry, but he's actually the guy to start it. So he was the tour guide, and these people would come out to the airport, which is what I tried to do when I first went out there. I was looking for this airport because that's where I heard everything was happening, that you could see it from the airport. And so he had this CTV crew had gone out a couple of times, and they had seen it, but they weren't able to photograph it. And I interviewed all the people that were involved in this this film that was taken just before I got involved. And basically, what had happened was they went out there and they had about 7 or 8 people. They had a professional photographer who was involved in the town, who was trying to photograph this thing. Then this camera crew. And then what happened was they didn't get anything, and they were booking overtime. They were going out and they were booking overtime for this. And the news producer had said, okay, I've had enough of this garbage. That's it. Nobody's going out again. If you people want to film this stupid UFO thing, you can go on your own time. So what had happened was a bunch of these guys had figured, no, we're going to get this thing on film. And so they had gone on their own time. They had taken the TV camera, the big TV camera from the station, and they had gone out there, but they didn't have a guy to film the UFO. They didn't have a cameraman. So what they had was a film editor who had worked in the camera room but had never operated a TV camera before in his life. So he's got this big, huge TV camera. They go out and they're standing. There's a big microwave tower there. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has a microwave tower there, and they're at the bottom of this microwave tower. And then what they do is they had the editor of the local paper in the town, and they had Bob Diemert, who had the airport, and they had, I think, about 4 pilots, and they had the camera crew. And what they did was they saw this thing on the ground in the west. They were facing into the west towards this set of hills, and the thing was sort of glowing and going back down. And so what they did is they sort of, if people understand, here we have what are called mile roads. So you have mile roads going north and south and east and west, and so you get this checkerboard effect if you look at it from the air. So they could tell exactly where they were. They would go up a mile down that road, and these roads are completely straight, that we would actually drive down these roads without lights on because they were perfectly straight. You wouldn't have to worry about turns and stuff like that, or hills or anything. And anyway, they had sent somebody north of the object that was on the ground, somebody south of the object on the ground, and the guy, this film editor, is standing at the microwave tower, looking down the road at this object that seems to be fairly a few miles away. And the 2 groups go around this thing, and the one actually comes across and suddenly sees this thing on the ground. And the way he described the object, he said it looked like a movie screen, blood red movie screen, 50 feet high, sitting on an angle like a drive-in movie screen, and it wasn't touching the ground, and it was sitting behind this set of trees. They'd come out from a set of trees, like a windrow, and this thing was behind there. And then they were looking around to get their coordinates. There was certain the one guy was a pilot, and they were trying to figure out this microwave tower to figure out where they were at what mile road or how far they were from the various towns around them. And when they looked back, the thing was gone, and they couldn't believe it. They were maybe, because I've got photographs in the book how far it was away. They were maybe a quarter of a mile off the road, and this thing was in this field. And they looked around and they couldn't see it. Now, meanwhile, the guy is filming at the other end, and he says, okay, the next time this thing glows up, it would go down and it would glow up. He said, the next time this thing glows up, I'm gonna shoot the camera. So he shoots the camera, and just as he does, this thing takes off, and it jumps up into the sky. And that's why the guys who are on the ground, who are actually on the ground where this thing is, suddenly look around and the thing is gone. And it's moved up about, some of the analysis said 4,000 feet. It had gone from, if you look at the film, it's being shot at, I think, 24 frames a second. And if you look at the film, it's on the bottom of the frame. The second frame, it's what we call a flash frame, which is in actually one of the Billy Meyer films. There's what's called a flash frame, where you see the entire horizon light up, and then in the third frame, this thing is at the top of the frame. And when we measured from the microwave tower where the guy told me the camera was to the field where they actually had radiation readings, they'd actually gone in with the Winnipeg Planetarium with Geiger counters and actually determined where this thing had been sitting on the ground. They had radiation readings and all sorts of stuff. It was 8 miles away from the camera. And this thing had jumped from the bottom of the frame to the bottom of the frame to the top of the frame in 3 frames, and had left this flash frame where they'd lit up the entire horizon. And anyway, so then the thing starts going across he's filming, it's up in the air, and it starts going sort of slowly, very low from the ground, just slowly flying along, and it's pulsing this red, that's why they called it Charlie Redstar. It actually looked like it was alive. It was this weird sort of red pulsing object, and it sort of flew northeast around the north end of the town, and it was moving across, and he was filming with this big huge TV camera. And as he got to 12 o'clock and on looking directly north, he figured, I need to get a frame of reference. So he stopped the film, and the object flew through the camera, and then he followed it again. So they're all excited, and they go back to the TV thing. They drop off the film in the sort of an overnight thing where they develop the film. They throw it in there, and they come back in the morning, and they go to the film room, and they say, okay, we want to see the film. We dropped off the film, and they said, well, it really didn't turn out. And they said, what do you mean it didn't turn out? Well, there's only these 2 6-inch pieces of film that turned out. And they said, well, where's the rest of the film? And the guy said, well, we cut the film up and we threw it in the garbage. And I can remember one of the main guy who's turned out to be a major reporter with the CTV was furious. He said, and they were ripping through the garbage. They were trying to find this film that they'd cut out. And so the what's called the CKY film, which was shown on UFO Cover Up Live, this famous documentary in '88, it was shown there. J. Allen Hynek called it the best nocturnal light film in the world.
Yeah, in fact, it's on YouTube, and that noise that people might have heard just a little while ago is because I was playing the video, the beginning of it. It looks like Jacques Vallée is introducing the video in this old documentary.
Yeah.
And so it actually is on YouTube, and it's under Charlie Redstar or 1975, or you could just write Charlie Redstar and get there. So it's kind of cool that it's actually on YouTube, and only 91 people have looked at it.
Well, there you go. Well, there was a lot of people looking at it at the time, because what happened was suddenly it became famous. It was all over the place. NBC News actually ran the clip, and they wanted to come and interview the cameraman. But of course, the problem was he wasn't a cameraman. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling me that CKY had brought him in and said, okay, NBC wants to interview you. And they gave him $50 and told him to keep his mouth shut, that he wasn't a cameraman. So NBC came in and interviewed him. We never did recover the NBC clip, but NBC had played it on NBC Nightly News. It was all over the place, and it was what got me involved, because what had happened was when the camera was stationary, he had picked it up. It jumped. As soon as he started to move the camera, nothing got picked up. And when he stopped the camera at say at the 12 o'clock point to get a frame of reference, they suddenly had picked up on the film again. And you can see this thing actually if you analyze the film, we slowed it frame by frame. You can actually see the film. The object is actually moving up and down on a sort of a sine wave, and it's actually pulsing at certain parts of the flash of the wave. So we had done all this analysis, and they had done analysis, and all the guys were very upset, the guys that had filmed it, because they'd sort of been sort of shafted. But once this film was done, then I said to my friends, we were driving around the city again doing nothing, and I said, come on, there's this film, let's go see what these guys are looking at. So we drove out, and there was my friend who, as I said, I still have breakfast with him.
That's what's really funny. I can think, I just imagine, you guys, these college kids, and with nothing to do, driving around town in your cars, looking for something to do.
Yeah. So we go to the town, and it's a town of about 2,000 people. It's a farming community. It grows grain, and that's about it. I mean, they have a golf course, and they have a little tiny airport, but there's nothing in this town. I mean, absolutely nothing. So we go into the town, and of course, I hadn't, done astronomy or done anything. I had no idea what we were going to look for here. Mm-hmm. So we drove into town, and I'm looking around, and we're going like, well, what's everybody looking at? And we drove around, and we didn't see anything. And I'm pretty sure it was Venus was setting sort of in the western horizon. And we thought, well, that's kind of neat. But I mean, if that's what everybody's looking at, well, that's not very impressive. And I remember my friend saying, uh, he says, okay, we're going to drive out of town one more time. We'll drive into town, and if we don't see anything, that's it. And we'd all agreed. The other guy in the back seats, yeah, that's fine.
A-
That's it. We've had it with
And
this. Is a bunch of nonsense.
by this time, you had seen the video on the news?
I had seen the video, yeah.
Okay.
And so we're driving into town. This is after an hour of driving around, seeing really nothing that was out of the ordinary. And it was, and I always explain to people how important it is when it comes to actually seeing something that is really a UFO, not something that's sort of a light in the sky or something. That there are people, if you haven't seen a UFO, you can either believe or disbelieve. But that's all you can do. And belief and disbelief, it really has no relevance to reality. When we were looking, we were saying, well, is this what they're looking at? What they're looking at? When we came in, we were coming into town the last time. We were about a mile out of town. As soon as this object appeared, coming from the south, coming across in front of the car, going into the north, there was no question. There was nobody said, is that what we'd been doing it for an hour? Is that what they're looking at? Is that what the thing is? As soon as this thing appeared from the left, coming to the right in front of the car, everybody just said, there it is. It was just like instantaneous. We knew this is what everybody was talking about. It was so dramatic. It was so much out of the ordinary. And it was like it was moving up and down. It was fairly close. At night, you can't really tell how far it was away, but it was, a mile, no more than a mile. It was very, very low, which, treetop level. Most of the time it would fly at treetop level. So it was coming in front of the road, and I could still remember this. We called that a bobbing motion. It was actually like a bobber on a fishing line, sort of moving up and down. It wasn't really moving in a straight line, and it wasn't moving very fast. It was moving much slower than a plane. It was just sort of moving in front of the car. And I can remember it was sort of like this instant sort of panic and excitement. And it was so low, there was a set of school buses that they had parked outside the town. And I can still remember I could tell it was going to go so low, it was going to go in behind these school buses. The car was still moving. I was in the front seat passenger. I was getting out of the front seat of the car while the car was still moving to get across the ditch so I could get to these school buses, so I could see this thing when it was behind the school buses. And we had that sighting, and my friends, I can still remember my main friend I've known for 50 years. He went on with his life. Nothing changed with him. He was there the second night with me, and I can still. There's been a number of times over the 50 years where people will say, they'll know I'm into UFOs. We'll be sitting with him having breakfast or lunch or something, and I'll be describing, and then suddenly I'll say, well, Larry was with us, and they would go, you were there? You actually when this happened? And he would say, yeah, I was there. And then they say, well, I've never heard you talk about it. You've never said anything about it. What did you see? He said, whatever Grant says, that's what we saw. And it's kind of weird that everybody that was involved with me, and I had a number of sightings over a year and a half. Because I sort of fell off the end of the earth. I just sort of gave up on everything. And I went out there and I talked to people and I investigated. I was just fascinated with this thing. Most of my friends and people I took out to see this thing just went on with their life. Really nothing changed. For me, it was completely different. It was sort of like I just couldn't get enough.
Right.
And after that first sighting, I was so amazed by this thing. And the second night, I think
well,
it was
that
a
first
Saturday.
night, just real quick,
Yeah.
on what you saw. So you guys are driving and they shoot the kind of darts across the street in front of you.
Yeah.
Did it
Going
look?
very slow, not darting, going very, very slow.
Oh, really? Very slow. And
Oh,
it
very
was
slow, yeah.
Was it moving like the video where it was kind of doing that up and down kind of movement?
Yeah, that it wasn't in the video. You have to slow it down to see that up and down motion, but it just had this bobbing motion. It was sort of like sometimes you see UFO films where it's unstable, where it's sort of moving. It's not moving like a plane. Like a plane is just moving in a straight line. This was sort of like it was having trouble moving it, and that gave it that bobbing motion. And I think the
Weird.
term bobbing motion came from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had a sighting, which was the National Enquirer had written up, and they had gotten these RCMP guys, and they described it as a bobbing motion. So I think that's where the term comes from. But everybody described this Charlie Redstar had this sort of weird sort of moving motion, and very, very slow and very, very low to the ground. It was always this same sort of description that people would give. So that was the first night. And then I was just amazed by this. So I went to all my friends and I said, you got to come see this. This is the most amazing. And I'm just like crazy. And I dragged out a bunch of my friends, and it must have been a Friday or a Saturday night, because they all came. And then we were still trying to find the airport. I didn't know where the airport was, and that was because it was just a small airport and they didn't have runway lights on at night. They'd only have planes would fly in during
And
the
the
day.
airport was where most people were having the sightings.
Well, where the newspaper was talking about, because they would go there during the day and talk to Bob Demert, and they would set up at the airport. But at night, you really couldn't see the airport because they never had the runway lights on. So the second night, we were actually standing at the end of the runway, and we didn't even realize we were at the airport because it was like it's pitch dark. It's a small town,
Right.
and so I remember the second night we were there, and there's about 25, 27 people there, and these are people coming from all over the place. There was all my friends, and I'd have maybe 8 people I think were my people, and then there was all these other people that were around, and there was kids that would drive around and they'd sit in the back roads and drink beer and stuff. But there was a lot of people that were just on the back roads trying to see this Charlie Redstar. So there's 27 people all there, and we were sitting there waiting, and really nothing's happened. I think it was about 12:30 at night. And I can remember my friends said to me, they said, "Oh, Cameron, this is a waste of time. We're going home." And I said, "No, you got to see this. I mean, hang on. This is amazing. If you see this, it's unbelievable." And then I can still remember them saying, "Nah, Cameron, we've had enough. We're going back to Winnipeg. We're hungry. We're going for pizza."
So
and
out of those 30 people, how many of them were your friends?
I would say there was about there was 4 in our car, and then another 5, so about nine people that I knew.
So the rest of them are kind of like Close Encounters, where they're all waiting for the UFO.
Yeah.
They just kind of
Yeah.
go hang out with their and wait
Yep.
for the things to show up.
They were all just sort of appearing on the back road, and everybody was just sort of, "Are you looking for this thing?" And we're looking for this thing. And
Wow.
so about 5 of my friends take off, and left. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 of us left in our car. And when the object actually did appear, which is about maybe 20 minutes after my friends finally gave up and took off, there was a car beside us that had 4 people in it. And I remember it was a Roadrunner courier car. It was a courier car, and there was a girl and 3 guys, and they were there. And then there was us on this gravel road near the airport. And suddenly there was a flash on the western horizon, and the couple of you take these kids out who were doing science fair projects, maybe 13, 14 years old, and they were sitting in the field, and I can still remember there was a flash, like a flash cube in the western sky, and one of the kids yells out from the road, "Is that it?" And I didn't know, because it didn't look like the same thing as the first night. And then the flash, it was a different part of the sky, and then a different part of the sky. And then I said, "Yeah, I guess that's it." And then the panic just broke out. These kids come running out of the field, and this thing, later I would interview. There was a very controversial family that was involved, and at one point I went to their farm to interview them, and they weren't there. And I interviewed their little kids, who were about 7 and 9 years old at the time, and I asked them and they described this as the bouncing ping pong ball. And this was like a flash. It'd be like a flash cube, but it would be 8 inches in the field of vision. It was just bouncing around the sky, just jumping all over the sky on the western horizon, just flash, 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 flash. But it was never in the same spot. It was moving all over the place, and it was just bizarre. And I can still remember it was like a football game where the home team is about to score. There was people swearing, yelling, screaming, and this girl in this Roadrunner courier car beside us couldn't see the object, and she's crying, "I can't see it. Someone show it to me," but it was bouncing around the sky. And the guy beside me, this is when motor drives first came out on 35 millimeter cameras, and I can remember this guy had this with a telephoto lens on it, and he had the camera on top of the car, and I could hear this girl crying, I could hear people yelling and screaming, and I could hear this motor drive going click, zzz, click, zzz, and he was just unloading the camera as this thing was coming towards us. Now, as it got closer, then the flashes got closer together, and then when it finally came in close, the flashes sort of disappeared, and this red object that I'd seen the first night appeared, and it was coming directly at us, and of course it was just like Panic City. These people were just total excitement, and it was coming at us, and I could remember it was sort of moving, and it sort of hesitated, and it was sort of on an angle. You couldn't really see the shape of it because of the red glow was so intense, but you could tell it was longer than it was high, and it had this green glow on the back of it. And all I could think to myself was, these are people from another planet flying by Carmen. What the heck are they doing here? It just didn't make any sense, because to me it was just evident that this was just this weird thing, and I'd always seen it as sort of extraterrestrial. And I'm thinking to myself, like, they're driving around burning gas. Like, what are they doing? Because they didn't seem to be doing anything, and they just sort of started to move, and they were moving around the north side of town, the same as the first night. It was moving into the northeast, and I can remember the people in the car next to us just said, "We're going to chase it," and they jumped in their car. And off they went, and I can remember the gravel was flying, and down the road they went after this because it moves very, very slow.
They need to
And they
make a movie about this.
yeah, so they and I left it for, unfortunately, I left it for about 4 or 5 months before I went to try to find this film. And we'd never introduced ourselves to these people. They just were in the car beside us. We didn't leave to chase it after. We just went home after that. And I went later to try to find this film. And I went to the Roadrunner Courier Car Company, and I said, I'm looking for this girl. She had a, because they were run by, the cars were run by girls. So I said, this girl had a car, and she was out in Carmen, and she, and then I get into the UFO story and stuff. And they said, yeah, we sort of remember a girl talking about this kind of stuff, but we can't remember exactly who it was, because we have a lot of people go through this company, and she's not here anymore. So I never did track down this film, because I always wanted to see this film, because this thing was fairly close, and it was coming right at us. And I remember this guy, he must have unloaded the entire roll of film on this camera. And so that was the second night. And then I was just like, I couldn't get enough. I mean, I just figured, like,
So that was the moment right
why
there.
is nobody investigating this? I figured, because I knew there was the rumor that the vast majority of the town had seen this thing. And I'm going, like, why is, the NBC not here, and every news station here, and why is not anybody?
Right.
So then I went to look for Bob Diemert, and because he ran the airport. And that's led to this investigation. It took me about a year and a half, where I went there, and I went from person to person and interviewed all these people, what they had seen, and tried to put this whole story together of this flap that lasted for about a year and a half.
So how old were you at this time?
I think I was about 22 at the time. It was 75, 21 when it first started, when I had first had the sighting. And I was going to university at the time, and I continued my courses, but I really decreased. I just, university, I was having a hard time trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do with this nonsense. It all seemed like just a waste of time. And when I saw this, it was like, wow, this is what, we got to be working on. So I just basically spent a lot of time, just every second day I'd travel out there, and I had a lot of sightings. And the first year it was the big objects, and then the second year, when it moved to Sperling, which is about 11 miles away, we started to pick up these small objects on the ground, which, if people have seen the best way I can describe them, the first night they were orange, but when I got really close, I got about 50 feet away. But after that, they were, the best I can describe is, if you've seen the orb balls that are described, that are shown in the crop circles in England, where you see these orange or these white balls flying around. Well, we saw these in mass, and I would take people out. I would take tours of people. They'd say, okay, I can photograph this thing. And somebody from the university who would, be in the audiovisual department, who could get all the equipment and stuff. And, okay, you want to come out? And I would take these people out, and everybody would be trying to film this stuff. And we'd do infrared photographs, and we'd, try to surround these things. And so I said, in the second year, I took a lot of tours of this secondary stuff. And the whole thing had a lot of bizarre stories, had a lot of film that we took. And in the end, what happened was, I figured this was fantastic. And Bob Diemer's wife had helped me write the manuscript, put it all together. And we had taken it around to try to get it published in the States, in Canada. And a lot of the publishers in the big city, Toronto, had read it. And then one looked at it and then said, no, they wouldn't do it. But it was a local story. So I went to the local publisher in Winnipeg, and the publisher and everybody in Winnipeg knew the story. And I'd taken it to her, and I can still remember the rejection letter. She said, Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers. And that was the end. And that was when I sort of gave up on UFO sightings. I said, this is just a pile of nonsense. I can tell all these stories of what I saw, and I had some dramatic sightings. But in the end, nobody really believes it. So I wanted to sort of justify for myself that this was for real, and also to realize that if I had seen this, and if all these people had seen this, the government, somebody must know what's going on here. And that's when I went after the chase to go after the Canadian government, and from there to Eric Walker, and from there to the presidents, and just started this search, because I sort of gave up on UFO sightings. It was dramatic. The manuscript is still out there. I wrote all these different stories, and just bizarre. And as what happened with these sightings was, there were so many sightings that you would get somebody, you'd hear a story, okay, somebody saw something. You track the person down, you'd say, okay, I heard you had a UFO sighting, can I talk to you about it? And the person would say, well, how'd you find out about that? First question, how'd you know? How do you know? Who told you? And then I'd say, oh, okay, so and so told me. And then they sort of open up and they'd say, okay, well, and then they'd tell you their sighting. And then at the end of this, it was always the same thing. At the end of the story, they would always say the same thing. But I'm not the only one that saw it, you know. You got me, but and then they would give you about 5 or 6 other people who had seen the same thing. And at
Right.
one point, I believe I had 350 people on a list that I hadn't even interviewed yet. People squealing on people that everybody had seen it. In fact, there was this one, as I mentioned, this one controversial family who had had a bunch of cattle disappear and had the hydro line $700 hydro bills, and it had the thing land in the yard, and just all these bizarre things. And they were a family that when the wife told me when they went to the post office in this small town, she said that they knew everybody in town. They'd been there for years. As soon as she'd walk in to pick up her mail, people would just turn and walk out of the and just ignore them. They were just absolutely ostracized in this town. But when I started
Because of these strange experiences that they had.
Because they lost 32 horses. They had PMU horses. That they would raise PMU horses, pregnant horses, and they had one incident where the thing had come down and the horses had sort of gone crazy inside the barn, and then they lost 32 horses at a sort of a field that they had kept a second set. They have some in the barn, and then they have a second set, and they lost 32 horses, which was a big story. And it was like, oh, the Lehmans, they're trying to collect insurance. This is a big scam.
So they died? Just these horses all
They
died?
just disappeared.
They disappeared completely.
Disappeared. And he tried to collect insurance on this thing, but they had all these other stories. Like they had the thing land in the yard, and they had the thing land, and then the reaction by the horses inside the barn, and they had a lot of bizarre stories. That's when I said one time when I went to interview them, they weren't there, but their kids were there. So I started to say to the kids, okay, what did you see? And I had this long interview with these kids who were like 5 and 7 years old, and they would tell the same stories, that it was justifying the fact that this was a really weird, it was sort of like the center of the hurricane type thing. And it was about 8 miles, they lived about 8 miles north of the town. But when I interviewed all these people, I suddenly found out that everybody around them, all the farms around them, were seeing the same thing, but they were just terrified to talk about it because they didn't want to end up where the Lehmans were. They knew what had happened to the Lehmans. And I remember going back when I was going to lecture at Eureka Springs. This is only about 5 years ago. I'm going to lecture. I go back and I'm just taking photographs. So I go to the Lehman farm, and I want to take a photograph of the barn where this description of the horses sort of stampeding inside the barn, and the object lighting up the barn and all this sort of stuff. And I'm standing at the back along a road, and suddenly there's a truck coming out of the farm, and this guy is just, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And he's just demanding. And I said, well, I explained, he was a younger guy, and I said, well, I'm taking pictures, and I explained the UFO thing, and he said, oh, he says, I was 1 year old at the time. And I remember he was in a crib when I would interview the parents. This guy was in a crib, and he told me he was 1 year old when this happened. And when he went through school, he said he was just absolutely ridiculed by kids.
Wow.
And he was 1 year old when this thing happened. And here's this guy years later coming to me to sort of think I'm trying to, break into the farm or something. And it's this kid who was 1 year old when I was being interviewed. But this was the type of thing that for example, when I lectured at the high school, I went to the Carmen High School and I lectured there, and I would always do a poll, and I would send out, put a questionnaire. How many people have seen a UFO in the last 2 years? How many people have seen a 747 in person? Not a picture of a 747. This is back in the 70s. And I'd have all these different questions. And when I did the Carmen High School, the number of people who claimed to have seen a UFO in the last 2 years was 59%. In most places, it was like 11 or 14%. But in certain towns, you could tell where the towns were. I would do even like grade 4, 5, and 6 kids, or different ages. And I did all the schools. In the poll, you could basically see where the flap was. That if it wasn't a flap area, that you would have 14% people, but in Carmen it was 59%. So there was a lot of people that seen it. And then the bizarre thing was, you had this
all of that's bizarre.
Yeah, you have this whole thing going on, and then in late 75, it basically stops in Carmen and it moves to this town beside there. And I always described it as if the CIA had taken the drugs out of the water. This town had really had no sightings. Suddenly, they have 59% of the high school claims they've seen this thing. People are all reporting this thing, and then it stops. I go back. As I said, I'm lecturing at Eureka Springs back in 2005, 2006. I go back. I talked to Bob Deemer. I said, Bob, how many sightings did you have back in the Carmen time? And he said, I don't know, maybe 150. And I had about 100. He had 150. So he had the most sightings. He was there all the time. All these people. He taking people out at night and stuff like that. And I said, how many sightings have you had since 1976? And he said, oh, well, and just starts describing this sighting. And all of a sudden he says, freeway. And I said, freeway? What are we talking freeway? And he said, well, I was going through Phoenix. And I said, no, Bob, how many in Carmen, Manitoba since 1976, how many UFO sightings have you had? And he said, none. So he had 150 in 1975. 1976 till 2005 hasn't had a single sighting, and the town has. I can't think of a sighting in that town since then.
Right.
And as I said, it was like the CIA taking the drugs out of the water. It just went away.
One quick question: the Lehman family.
Yeah.
So people must have thought that they were lying about their horses to get insurance.
Yeah.
Do you believe them? Do you believe their horses disappeared?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, they may have been stolen, but they definitely were. They definitely were missing. And then when I talked to him about it, was the area where it happened was about 20 miles north, which was at a town called Portage de Prairie, where there was an Air Force base, small Air Force base.
Mm-hmm.
And this was near there. And he would describe to me this daylight sighting that he had of this object before the horses disappeared in this field where he would he'd take these other horses out there, and then they'd move back to the barn. They said these two sections about 20 miles apart where they would have this. So he had this, but he had all these other just really weird stories of the thing flying over top of the house, landing on the yard. It was just like the Twilight Zone. This one family having just like a lot of people would have sightings. They'd see the Charlie Redstar flying around or something like that. But these people had just weird sightings, just bizarre, close encounter type stuff. And that's what sort of separated them from everybody else. And everybody really didn't want it, especially when this horse story broke. It was like, this is too much. I mean, it was like, because they were getting written up in the paper about the landing in the yard, stuff like that.
Did they see entities?
They saw what she described to me. She could see somebody walking around like it was lit up. She could see, but she couldn't see what they actually were. She could see some sort of beings or some sort of something moving around the bottom of the craft on the one time that it landed in the back field behind the house. But they basically never talked after that. I talked to them, and the son had arranged for me. I wanted to re-interview them 30 years later, and they never did contact me. It was quite apparent that they didn't want this to be revisited. And even in the town, if you go to the town, I would say the vast majority of the people of the town, the young people, probably don't even remember this type of stuff. It was very heavy at the time, but it was a story that sort of faded away. And because there was never a book published, it was never promoted. The stories just sort of died. Like my son goes there to golf all the time, and he talks to people, and a lot of people sort of faintly recall that something happened back in the 70s, but nothing really major. And that sort of led me to, this whole going from town to town, categorizing all the stuff, getting into these what we call ground lights, and what the Canadian government guy that I talked to called monitors, and a whole new series of bizarre things where, the one experience where I got so close I was going to jump on the thing. And I was
now we do need to get into your experiences, especially a couple of them. This one where you saw something and you were going to jump on it, and then the other one where you were with the kids and it flew over your car.
Yeah.
I want to talk about those.
Okay.
Is this a good time?
Yep. Okay. So as I said, the first year the big ones are flying around Carmen. Then it seems to move to Sperling, Manitoba, and there's a couple of people there. 30 years later, a guy comes with these abduction experiences. And I said to him, they put in contact because I had done the sightings, and he had these weird experiences. And I just said to him, my first question at Sperling, I said, as I said, there's these mile roads. And I said, well, where did you live from Sperling? And he's describing these basically what it sounded like abduction experiences. And so I said, well, where were you? And he said, west. And I said, well, how far west? He said, 2 miles over. And we were on the 2nd mile road. So he was on the north side of the highway. We were on the south side of the highway heading towards the U.S. border. So these mile roads run north and south, like towards the border. And so I had a friend of mine, and we're trying to photograph, and he's one of these guys. He's got all the camera equipment, and we're standing on the edge of Sperling, and it's like just before dusk, just after it gets dark. That's when sometimes you get some pretty good sightings. So it's just that we're waiting at dusk. We're on this corner on the highway, and nothing's really coming. We don't see anything, whatever. And it gets dark, and I look around, and I said, Jim, what's all these orange lights? And it looked like farm lights, because there's a town, and this town's maybe 300 people. And then other than that, there's nothing. And as I've described to you before, it is the flattest part of the world. I mean, it's just absolutely flat, and there are no trees. If you've seen the film of the infrared photographs we take of these balls on the ground, you'll see on the left-hand side, you'll see a tree. Well, we know exactly where that tree is, because there's only one tree on the whole. It used to be a farm there, so there's one tree. There's nothing. It's as green, and so we're standing there, and we're looking, and there's these lights which look like farm lights, except they're as orange as oranges. They're absolutely orange. And I'm saying, this is weird. So nothing's flying over. So I said, well, let's go down, let's go south, and let's see what these orange lights are. Let's see what's going on. So we drive down a sort of a road going east-west, and we're crossing mile roads going north-south towards the U.S. border. So we cross the first mile road. I look down, there's nothing there. And we go to the second mile road, and we look down the second mile road, and this big orange ball is sitting right in the middle of the road. And you can't really tell how far it's away. It looked like it's about a quarter mile away. And I said, look at that. There's this orange ball sitting in the middle of the road, in this mile road, and we're looking directly towards the U.S. border. And we're maybe 20 miles from the border. So 20 miles down this straight road will hit the U.S. border. So we're looking down there, and I said, well, let's drive down. So we drive to where we thought it was. We thought it was about a quarter mile down the road. We drive a quarter mile down the road, and we look, and it still seems to be a quarter mile down the road. So we drive down another quarter mile, and then we come to the first mile road going east-west, and that's where they're burning the garbage for the town. And so we look, and well, no, the garbage is on our right-hand side, this fire, but the object's still in the middle of the road. So we go down, and we're gradually going farther and farther down this road, and we get 8 mile roads south towards the U.S. border. So we're there, and then it's April, I think it was April the 1st or March the 30th, 1976. And because it's so flat, as soon as the snow melts, it floods all the fields, and all you have is the roads. So there may be only 3 inches of water in the fields, but it's so flat that it just spreads all over everywhere. So we're looking, and the fields all around us, it looks like a huge lake around us, and just this road. We're on this road, and they have a drainage ditch which drains the water off these farm fields. And it's just a slight incline, a wooden bridge that goes over, and then they have this drainage thing that'll drain the water from the fields. So we get down 8 mile roads, and this orange ball is sitting on top of the bridge. And now you can see it because you've got a vantage point. You've got the bridge, you've got the wood and all this sort of stuff, and you can actually see where it is. Now you know exactly how far it's away. So I said, let's go. So we go up on top of the bridge, and I have a movie camera, an 8mm movie camera, and we got a set of binoculars. So we get out, and now the object's gone. So we're standing on top of this drainage bridge, this wooden drainage bridge, and I'm looking around, and I said, well, it's got to be here somewhere. I mean, it was here, sitting on the bridge. And I said, well, it's not south. We look down the road. It's not south, so it must be under the bridge. So we're looking under the bridge, and we're trying to see under the bridge, and we got flashlights and stuff. Couldn't see anything, so we get back in the car. We continue south towards the U.S. border. We go down the other side of the incline, down maybe a quarter mile south of the bridge. I look back, and I said, Jim, it's back at the bridge again. And I said, come on, let's go back to the bridge. It's got to be this. So we drive up on the bridge, and of course the thing's gone again. And I said, it's got to be under the bridge. It's got to be hiding under the bridge here. It's turned its light out or whatever it's doing, and it's under the bridge. So there was snow, and the water was so high underneath the bridge that you really couldn't look under the bridge. But we're trying to look under the bridge and hang off these snow piles on the side of the bridge, and we couldn't see it. Get back in the car. Now we're heading north. We're heading away from the U.S. border now. We go down the incline. We're heading north. Looking north, we get about a quarter mile, and I turn around, and I said, Jim, it's back at the bridge. I said, let's walk this time. Let's not take the car this time. This time let's walk, because it's going to take off on us. It's done it twice. So we go. I got the movie camera. He's got the binoculars. And so we start to walk. And what I do, and I still got this film. I got 3-minute films, and it's one of these 3 films. And I've developed it, but I've never had it analyzed or filmed. And this is the film I'm taking. I figure it's going to take off. So I take 7 steps, and I take 3 seconds of film. 7 steps, 3 seconds of film. 7 steps, 3 seconds of film. The next thing I know, we're at the bridge, and this thing is there. And I'm like close. I mean, like I'm at the bottom of the incline of the bridge, and I can still remember today. And you'll see when people describe UFO sightings, I can sort of tell whether it's a legitimate UFO sighting if they describe this one thing, and we called it a dead light. People will describe a brilliant object that's there, and it's so bright you can't look at it, but it's not casting light anywhere, that it doesn't light anything up. And this is what this was. And I can still remember to this day, that's the main thing I remember about this ball, this orange ball sitting on the right-hand side of the bridge. And it's about 1 or 2 inches away from the wooden railings on the side of the bridge. And it is so bright that with the binoculars, you really can't look at it. And we're very, very close. And I can still remember it was just casting this sort of an orange glow on the wooden railings. And I'm thinking, this thing is so bright. Why is it not lighting up this bridge? It was just so weird. It was this brilliant, but we called it a dead light. It was like a light inside a bag, very, very bright light inside a bag where the light isn't cast off. So I said to Jim, I said, I'm going to jump on it. And he says, you're going to jump on it? I said, yeah. And they was so close. I said, it's going to take off. It's going to go under the bridge. And before it gets under the bridge, I'm going to hit it. I'm going to touch it. And I realized, because we had the Michalak case, which we knew about, that Stephen Michalak had happened on the other side of Winnipeg. This is this famous case where this object lands and this prospector is there and he sticks his head in and the door is open and he's yelling in there and the door closes and it turns and he gets burned. So everybody in Winnipeg knew this UFO story about this guy that got badly burned. So I realized that when I hit this thing, I may get burned or whatever, but I was so close that I was determined. It was like, I had to touch it to believe it. And so I said, I'm going to jump on it. And then he says, well, hang on. He's got the binoculars. I got the movie camera. And he says, hang on. He says, I think there's one sitting on top of the car. So I turned around to look into the north, and it looked like the sun coming up. It was orange. It looked like the sun coming up in the north and was sitting on top of the car, this sort of a half circle of orange, like a ball, but only half of it. And this orange smoke hanging down the side of the car. And I go, it's sitting there right on top of the car. And so I started to run. Like I took the binoculars. I gave him the camera. I took the binoculars. That's when I saw it was sitting on top of the car. And I started to run. And as soon as I took about 3 steps, then I suddenly realized that we'd been had. And I turned around. Sure enough, the one at the bridge was gone. Then by the time we got back, we were running towards the car, and it was about a quarter mile. We're running towards the car. The thing moved onto the front hood, and then it looked like the inside of the car was on fire. You could see it through the back and through the front window. And by the time we got there, it had gone down and into the water or whatever happened. And I can still remember I got back there, and, like this is, I'm not scientific background or whatever. I didn't know what the heck to do. I felt the top of the car. Is it hot? I did, here I am, and I'm in the middle of something that's actually happened, and I don't know what the heck to do. And so I said, we're sort of playing around the car, and I'm trying to figure out, what do I do to document what's just happened here? And I looked back and I said, Jim, the thing's back at the bridge again. I said, come on, let's go back to the bridge. And he says, no, I don't want to go back. And I said, come on, we got close. I want to touch this thing. I want to jump on this thing. And he said, no, I don't want to go. And I said, well, and it was his car. So what am I going to do? We got in the car and we went home. The next night he comes out and they're still orange the second night. They turn to white, like these lights, these orbs that you'll see in the crop circle things. But the first couple of nights when the water was on the ground, they were orange. So the second night he comes out with his buddy, and they're chasing down these mile roads with the lights off, 60, 70 miles an hour, trying to catch these orange balls. And I can still remember him with his buddy, and we had our car, but he was chasing these things, trying to catch these things. And then I remember I saw him 20 years later, and it's the only experience I've ever had in ufology. If you see a UFO, you don't doubt. If somebody hasn't seen, they can be skeptical, and it really doesn't bother me. I remember I went back to the main library in Winnipeg, and I met him outside the library, and he said, well, how you doing? And I said, oh, fine. And he said, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm just going to get some books. He said, are you still in that UFO thing? And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, yeah, you always were the gullible type. And I said, gullible? And I swore at him. I said, you were the guy that wouldn't go back. No, I don't want to go to the bridge. I want to go home. And I said, I can't believe you're saying this. And he was just sort of backing away. And I was furious because it was the only time in my life when somebody who had actually seen something would play the skeptic. But the problem was that he'd become the public relations officer for $1 billion corporation here in Manitoba. Mm-hmm. And now it was like, I'm the big shot guy. I'm a public relations guy. And, but it was just weird. And I was saying, You were so scared. You know darn well what we saw. What do you mean? I'm gullible? You were so scared. I'm not gonna go back to the bridge.
Well, it's
And
funny because people will do these investigations like this guy, and they don't know what to do, and they keep going out even though they get scared. Something happens, they get scared, they go home. It's like, well, what are you going to do if you see something again? Why do you keep going out if you just get scared and go home?
yeah,
And then,
yeah,
unfortunately, get these little kind of curtains of denial that they build.
yeah. That was very strange. So that was the one, and then
So on this one, like, would you have if he hadn't turned around and seen that object over the car? Would you have jumped on it?
yeah, I was
You
about
were
to run.
totally determined. You were
Oh,
almost on there.
I was so close that I said I'm going to jump on it, and I was just about to jump. I was just about to run. I realized that I could run, and that even if it moved, I would maybe have enough time to hit it before it would get away, unless it turned off or did something. But I was that close that it was sort of like you get close enough. It's like an animal where you see like a cat is creeping up on something, and then you get
Mm-hmm.
to the point where, okay, if you get any closer, this thing's going to realize you're there and it's going to take off. It's like, okay, I'm close enough where I can get it before it takes off. And that's the point. I was that close that I was just about to take off, and he said, hang on. And that's when he told me there's one on, I think there's one at the car. And then I said, well, give me the binoculars. And then I stopped, and I just turned around and I looked, and I was just like another suddenly, like one dramatic thing to another dramatic thing. And it was like sitting on the car, and it immediately, I started to run. It's like, we got to go. This thing sitting on top of the car, and it was stupid. I mean, and looking back, I would have just, turned around and said, well, okay, fine, because they were all around us. When we got down this road,
Right.
about 8 miles, we looked around in these water fields, and it was just bizarre because there was orange lights all around us, and they looked like double oranges because they were sitting on top of the water. So you'd get and
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure it was the reflection off the water. So it was double oranges, these orange balls. And then after the water disappeared, they turned to white, and we would go out there, and I would take tours of people out there, and we would photograph. For example, we'd get the infrared photograph. If you've seen the book, you've seen the pictures of the infrared that we
Yeah.
took. And what we'd do is we'd get infrared photographs we'd keep in a freezer, and then you'd race out there. As soon as it got dark, you'd race out there with your frozen film, and you would do these infrared photographs. And people would say, okay, let's surround it. And I'd say, we've done this. We'd do things like we'd drive down the road, and we'd push the thing back down the road, and then I'd jump out of the car, and I'd roll into the ditch, and the car would keep going, and you'd push it down 2 miles, and then they'd come back down the road, and the thing wouldn't come back down, follow the car back. You'd get in the car, and you'd take off, and the thing would follow you down. It was like it was always one step ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would take tours out there, and people would say, okay, let's surround it. And I'd say, no, I don't want to surround it. You can't surround it. We've tried to surround it. We did all these different things. And I would say there's probably 100 people that I took out on various tours where they would all say the same thing. It's a light at the end of the road. I said, okay, it's a light at the end of the road. The horizon is completely flat. The horizon will be 6 miles at a 6 foot level. How long do you think it's going to take the car to get here? And they'd say, okay, it'll take about 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Okay, let's sit here and wait. After 5 minutes, you say, you still think it's a car? It's still there. It's still not moving. They say, oh, it's a car going from right to left. Well, then why is it just sitting on the road? So you'd go through these sort of mental exercises with everybody that would come out, and then they'd say, okay, let's go down the next mile road over, and we'll come in behind it, and we'll get it between us. And I'd say, we tried that, it doesn't work. And we try all these different experiments. And at the end, I got so frustrated that I'd say, well, let's go and look at the lights on we called it little Charlie Redstar, little Charlie. We would look at little Charlie, and I'd say, okay, here's a map. You go down this Highway 3, you turn at 205, you go to the second mile road, you turn right at the second mile road, and you go down that mile road, and it'll be there. I don't want to go. I have no interest in going out there anymore. And you guys can go and surround it and jump on it and shoot it. And people are doing all sorts of stupid stuff trying to get this thing. And people with these huge infrared, not infrared, but telephoto lenses that you would be shooting along the road, but you'd get so much heat coming off the road that you couldn't see anything. So nothing was really working. And we saw it at 40 below, because it gets 40 below here. I saw it at 40 below, saw it at like 100 above. I saw it in pouring rain, in snow. It was always there. And then we started to see them all over. We'd see the same sort of balls of light all around the countryside, and we could tell because of this dead light that if you looked at a car with binoculars, you could see the actual light coming off the lights. And these things, it would be like a dead light. There would be no light coming off it. So we did these different things, and then I had the second dramatic experience.
How
And
did
this,
your real quick? How did the film turn out?
it turned out, but as I said, I've never really had it analyzed. I
Okay.
remember I was took it to one of the big um, um, lecture theaters at the University of Manitoba, and set it up in the camera and screened it on one of the big lecture theaters. And it was an orange ball and it was moving around. But in terms of actually analyzing it, a lot of people are kind of surprised that I've had this film for 35 years, that
Yeah.
I was like, 50 feet or 75 feet away, and has never really been analyzed or transferred to digital and stuff. But I've never been a technical type of person. So I've still got the film. I got these 3 canisters of film, like these 8mm with 3 minutes each, these little blue things. And I've got 3 of them. And one is that film that was taken that night. And I can still remember it was bouncing around on the film, because is close, you're holding an 8mm and you're standing there as tight as you can hold that camera. You're not on a tripod, and you're going to get movement because it's this orange ball in a completely black environment, and so you get this movement. But other than that, I've never really done anything and analyzed the film. But we as I said, we started about a quarter mile, and this film every 7 steps all the way up till we're right at the bottom of the bridge shooting at this object. And
Right.
I've still got the film, and it's still sitting. It's been sitting in my drawer for 35 years. So that was one. And then the second dramatic one was one that later, when I interviewed one of the witnesses, is a kid who was doing a science fair project. I interviewed him. He had actually become a sort of an aeronautical engineer, and he'd gone to Europe, and I hadn't seen him. And he came back, and I was shoveling my mother's driveway, and he lives down the street. So he said to me, "Oh, are you still a UFOs?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Remember that sighting we had?" And I said, "Brian, don't say another thing. I've never talked to you about this in 35 years. I want to get you on camera." And I went and I filmed him, and I said, "Tell me the story of what happened this night." And this is the second incident I'm going to describe to you. I would take these kids out, and I'd take all sorts of people, and they'd want to see stuff. And I remember the one kid was sitting in the front seat. It was my best friend, the guy I've known for 50 years. It was his brother, and his brother was way younger than him. And he ended up working for the mayor of Winnipeg. And he's sitting there taking notes, and I've still got the notes. And we're driving around the countryside, and we're seeing these triangles of lights flying around. And he's taking notes, and there's balls, these small little Charlies on the ground and stuff, and we're sort of analyzing this. And we come to, there's a microwave tower at a town called Brunkild, and we see one of these ground lights. So I said, I'm describing these kids. These are these ground lights, and this is how they flare. And there's a triangle, and they flare from one corner to the other, and it gets bigger, and you can flash lights at them, and they'll flash back, and you can go side to side, and the thing will react to light. Which people always laughed at Stephen Greer, and I always said, don't laugh at Stephen Greer. You flash a light at a real UFO, and it will react. So anyway, I got these kids in the car. We're going south again towards the U.S. border. This is about maybe 10 miles from where the bridge was, where the first incident took place. We're heading down there, and we go about 6 miles, and we come to a cross, sort of a provincial road, going across a gravel road, and we sort of stop there because the road is actually disappearing. There's really not a road. It's sort of, now it's just a sort of a trail through a field, and I didn't want to get stuck. It was kind of wet. So I stopped on this side road, this provincial road, and I told the kids, I said, "Come on, I'll show you." And I took one kid at a time, and I took this kid that I interviewed, and ended up becoming like an aeronautical engineer. I take him out, and I said, "Watch this." And this light is there, and there's always 2 lights, and the one will react to the flashlight. So I flash the light 3 times, and this thing sort of pulses back 3 times. I take the light side to side, and this thing floats like people describe, and we saw this back then, like a leaf. It's flying back and forth like a leaf, side to side on the road. And this kid's going, "Oh, this is neat." And then I up and down, I take the thing, and the thing goes up and down, and the other one sits on the side of the road. It's much dimmer. It's sitting on the side of the road. And I go back to the car, and I take his brother, who I've never really talked to about since this incident occurred 35 years ago. I take his brother out, and I said, "Come on, I'll show you this." And I'm sitting there, and I flash the light at this thing 3 times, and the thing starts to whistle. It's like a Morse code, but a whistling noise. Bzz, bzz, bzz. And I'm going, "What the heck? This thing's making noise." And I'm thinking to myself, I've seen the thing. I've been 50 feet away. I know it's not very big. I know there's nobody in this thing. Therefore, we're bugging this thing with a light, and it's something up above is picking this thing up and it's reacting. And so I sort of like panic sort of set in, and I looked up, and on the American border, right on the right hand side of this thing is this huge arc welding light on the horizon. And I go, oh no, I've gotten this thing all mad. Now we're in trouble. And I just flashed at it, and I said to the kid, we better go back to the car. And so we walked back about 50 feet to the car. He gets in the back seat, and the kids are all jumping and they're screaming and they're happy and they're like, this is great. And this thing's going. And they described to me that when it went over the object on the ground, that a blue beam of light went down from the big object to the thing. I wasn't really looking, because I can describe it clearly as the scariest moment of my life. It was absolutely terrifying. It was like, we used to chase this thing. As we said, we drive down these mallet roads, we chase these things with our lights off, and then suddenly this time it had turned around. Now it's chasing us, and it was like instantaneous, absolute horror, panic, unbelievable. I can't even describe it. And so it went along the southern horizon. We're facing east. It's going parallel to us along the southern horizon, and it makes the turn. And then the panic really set in, because it makes the turn, and it starts coming down the road, and it's coming right at us, this arc welding light. And the kids I can remember them in the back, and they're yelling and screaming, here it comes, it's coming closer. And they're all yelling, and I'm panicking. I don't know what to do. So
this arc welding light, was the light going between two objects as it came towards you, or you just saw this length of arc welding type of light coming right at you?
Yeah, it had been started in the south. We were looking out. I'm looking out the passenger window because we're facing east, and it had gone along the horizon, but it had made this turn, and then it made the turn, and it started coming directly towards us.
So it's like one point of light, one intense
huge
light,
but then it turns into this huge triangle of light. It has two red lights on the front and a green light on the back, and I can't tell whether the lights were so big that I can't really tell whether it was three objects or whether it was three lights on an object. I still think it was three lights on an object, but then it turns to this triangle, and it's coming down, and we'd seen triangles, and we actually got a photograph of one of the triangles earlier. So we'd seen the triangles earlier, and it didn't surprise us that it was a triangle. So this triangle is coming right at us, and it's really, really low. And all I can remember was these kids yelling and screaming and all excited that here it comes, it's coming closer. And I'm just petrified. And I said, give me my binoculars, and they were in the back seat. So I took my binoculars, and I can still remember I'm sitting in the driver's seat, and this thing's coming right at us, and I'm looking up, and I put the binoculars against the inside of the glass because my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't hold the binoculars still. And I looked up, and as it got closest, right above the car, all I could see in the field of vision in the binoculars from one end to the other, it took the entire field of vision. It was massive. I mean, it was, and the lights appeared to me like 5-10 feet across, and it was just the whole field of vision was these three objects above me. And I was so panicked, I really couldn't tell whether it was like three objects or three. I thought it was three lights on the same object, and it appeared to sort of be on an angle with its back end hanging down. It was sort of tilted up. That's my impression, although it's just an impression I had. And it sat there, and then it sort of moved, it sort of slipped to the left a bit. It was there. I can't remember how long it was, which later made me think, well, maybe there was an abduction experience, because there was
some missing time
there, and I can't really tell whether the time was missing, but it was just weird because as soon as it slipped to the side, the fear absolutely went away. It was gone. Absolutely. Nothing there. It was like I went from absolute panic to, in 1 second, less than 1 second, to nothing. It was gone. It was, and that's where I thought it was like I remember Bob Pratt from the National Enquirer and I had gone after one pilot who described thing coming in front of the plane and the engine going off, and him describing this thing as being like a film. And this was the same thing to me. It was like a sort of a film where you took the film and then suddenly you cut the film and it's frozen, and then you start the film again. That's what it was like. And the panic just instantly disappeared, and it sort of moved, and it started moving towards this microwave tower in the sort of the north, and it was heading towards the microwave tower, and you can see these lights, and now the panic is gone. I'm watching this thing, and all of a sudden in behind me there's all lights and there's flashing and stuff like this, and I realized there's the RCMP is right behind me, and this is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and somehow they come up in behind me without their lights on or something, and we're in the middle of this road. So
Wow.
that you can still see this triangle flying away, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is like the FBI in the States. It's a federal police force. And they had gotten caught. Two of their people had been caught early in the sightings in Carmen, and they had described seeing this object. Yes, and it looked like it had a black X on it. And these guys were transferred out right away. So it was sort of like the RCMP. They're not going to talk to anybody. They may be seeing stuff going on, but only the one set of officers talk. So these kids are there, and this guy comes and he's getting out of his car, and I said, watch this. I'm going to get to this guy, because I knew that they didn't want to talk about this. So the guy comes, and I roll down my window. He sticks his flashlight. He says, okay, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? And I said, you see that object there? And I just pointed, and this triangle is still very clear. It was only maybe 2 minutes after this incident had occurred. This triangle is flying towards the northeast, and he looks, and there's this 2 red and a green light, very clear, and it's flying quietly off to the northeast. And he said, yeah, I see it. And I said, well, we're looking at these lights down at the end of the road. I didn't say anything more. And he said, what do you mean lights at the end of the road? And I said, well, turn off your lights and I'll show you. So he goes back to his car, and the kids, now they're excited. They're all just bouncing around. And I said, we're going to take them and show them. So we get out of the car. He turns his lights off. We go there, and I take the flashlight, and there's nothing. It's pitch black in the south, in the road. There's things gone when you need it. It's gone, eh? So I take the light, and I take the light up and down, and all of a sudden this sort of white light appears, and it goes up, goes back down again, and I take it from side to side, and this thing goes back and forth like a leaf back and forth across the road, and you can see this guy's looking, and the kids are all bouncing around, they're all excited, and then I flash it, and the thing sort of flashes back, and he says, it's probably just a couple of guys down at the end of the road having a beer. And I said, well, we've been chasing it for six miles. And I guess suddenly it occurred to him, because I'd been written up in the paper as wanting to jump on one of these objects just down the road. And suddenly he realized what this thing was, who I was, what this triangle on the sky was. And he suddenly realized he was in the middle of something he didn't want to be in the middle of. So he says, okay, I guess I'll see you guys. And he starts to walk, and he's walking towards the car. And I says to the kids, I says, get his license plate number. And the guy starts to run to his car, and he jumps in his car. The gravel's flying, and these kids have got this flashlight, and they're running down the road after this federal police officer. And they got the guy's license plate number, and I figured out which detachment he was from. And I was going to go interview this guy, and I was going to say, okay, we were out on the road that night. You came up to us. What happened? What did you see? And get this guy on the record. And I figured, nah, I gave up. I just figured I better leave the guy alone. But here we had an actual witness to the triangle and to this object on the ground. And so when I interviewed this kid 35 years later, I interviewed him, and I said, well, what do you recall? He doesn't recall the beam of light coming down. He recalls the flashing and the thing going back and forth across the road. And then he said, well, do you remember the metal? And I said, no, I don't remember no metal. He says, well, yeah, it came right above the car. And he said it had gunmetal, like gunmetal coloring on it. And I said, I don't remember any metal. So he remembers something very different when this thing came right above him. But he does recall the same sort of incident, that this thing was sitting right above us, right on top of the car. And it wasn't up that high. It was maybe 100, 200 feet up, no more than that. But he remembers metal. I just remember these huge, massive lights on this thing. And so we did that. And then we had the same kids. Once they had that experience, these kids would come up with me all the time. They were about 14, 15 years old, and they were doing their science fair projects and stuff, and they were all sort of into this. And we'd be trooping across fields trying to get these things, and trying to get closer to them and film them and stuff. So these kids, they all remember back. They're all now grown, 40, 50 years old,
Right.
and they'll all talk back about, oh, remember the days, but it was an intriguing time. But it was a story that really didn't get much publicity, because I wrote the manuscript. The manuscript really never got published.
Yeah.
But it was a dramatic time, and a lot of people were involved.
We're about out of time. Is there a way for people to look at the manuscript? I've been looking at the pictures as you're talking about it, because it helps give you an idea of how flat and how barren it is out there, this tundra.
Well, anybody that wants it, I've got it on A drive. So anybody that wants to look at it, if they send me a email at presidentialufo.com, I will provide them a link where they can download the manuscript. And the manuscript has actually the extra stuff, where I discovered that nuclear weapons probably had something to do with what we were doing, because when this thing occurred, the only operational anti-ballistic missile unit in the United States that was ever operational 80 miles south of Carmen, Manitoba, from February of 1975 to November of 1975. And all the Minuteman III missile silos are all running from there all the way up to the border, right up to the U.S.-Canada border. It was all the Minuteman III missile silos. And my sighting took place 2 weeks after the end of the Vietnam War. And what I think happened was that all the missiles went on alert. The Americans didn't know what was going to happen, whether South Korea was going to fall, the Philippines. It was a domino theory. Communism was going to take over the world. We just lost Vietnam. And so all the missiles are put on alert. They don't know what the Russians are going to do next. It's a real standoff. Everybody's scared, and the UFOs picked up the fact that all these missiles were on alert, and that's why they ended up on our side of the border. And when I talked to Bob Deemer, that's what he said to me. He said, "I told you why they were here. They were coming from the States. We told you. We were up in the hills. We watched them come from the States." And so anybody that wants it, it's quite an intriguing end.
And when did it all end?
It ended, well, the main Carmen stuff ended at the end of 75, but by the summer of 76, it had all ended, and there's been no sightings in either town since.
It's interesting. It reminds me of the Hesdalen lights or like the Brown Mountain lights. And of course, it brings to mind the Skinwalker Ranch, the stuff that happened to the laymen. So very incredible story. So I'm so happy that you were able to come and share this story, because I think it's really important. And I don't know if you've done any interviews just talking about that, but I think people need to know about it.
Yeah. Well,
hopefully your book gets published.
Yeah, I appreciate your getting into it, because it was an important part of my life, and it was when you see the massive numbers of sightings, it was one of the biggest flaps ever anywhere. Because in fact, the National Enquirer at one point was going to do a story, and they were going to call it UFO Capital of the World. Bob Pratt from National Enquirer, I took him around for 2 weeks, going from witness to witness. He was in the area for 2 weeks, interviewing witnesses all over the place.
All right. Thank you very much, Grant, for being on the show. Incredible story. And we will be back, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, and I'm dropping a bomb on Jason here, too, because I forgot to mention it. But I think we're going to take a week off, Jason, by the way. So we won't be here next week, but we'll be here the week after that with another great person. So see you in 2 weeks, people. Adios.